So the research is really looking at a puzzle that we observed in terms of new technologies being introduced into the market, but significant differences in terms of how fast they're able to reach mainstream adoption and disrupt existing markets, existing players. So we observed that in the printer space, inkjet printers came about quickly, took over the dot matrix. We look at HDTV, it took decades for it to be mainstream adoption. And then we look at things like the Segway or the Palm types of technologies, which either created some value or never really reached mainstream adoption. So the question was really what explains that why some technologies are introduced and immediately supplant existing technologies, whereas others take decades or sometimes don't really reach mainstream adoption. And so what we did was we tried to find a context where we could observe enough variation in terms of how quick or slow these technology adoption patterns were, but helped us to control for a lot of confounding effects as well. And so the idea was to find a natural experiment, so to speak, and that helps us to ensure that the source of variation is not driven by some systematic effects, which may make inferences more problematic. So what we did was we came across, I had some experience in the semiconductor industry. We came across the semiconductor lithography technology as a setting that we could study this question. What is interesting about this setting is this is kind of the engine behind Moore's law, or any progress in semiconductors over the last 40 years has been fueled by lithography technology. So it's important. We know it's fast-paced, and we thought that this is where we may want to study this question. And so the research design looked at the semiconductor lithography and 10 different new technologies that were introduced in that industry over a 40-year period. We interviewed about 30 industry experts to try to get a sense for what's driving these patterns. We collected data on technologies, markets, industries, in terms of really trying to understand the factors that may be explaining this difference. And what we found was interesting. A lot of the research and practice focuses on new technologies and how it interacts with the markets, and look at, is the technology better than what's available now, or it's not? And that explains whether it's going to reach mainstream adoption. What we found was that's sort of part of the explanation, and actually in our case, a very small part of the explanation. We found that the bigger explanation was not focusing on the new technology and the market, but looking at the technology ecosystem, which is to means that how is the technology created, what are the different elements that make up the technology. So think about batteries making up electric cars, but also how is the technology used by the users in terms of other elements or complementary technologies and services. Think about electric car and charging stations and garages who can fix that electric cars. And not only that, that you need to look at the technology ecosystem for both the new technology and the old technology. So what we set out is, we want to explain this variance. What we see from our field work and our interviews, that by looking at the technology itself, the resolution in terms of fast versus slow is not going to be very good. Let's look at the ecosystem. And so as part of the research, we collected data that systematically identifies each technology in terms of its ecosystem and compared in terms of the existing technology. And what we found was, when we think about the new technology, there's sometimes what we call an ecosystem emergence challenge, which means the technology is ready, but the ecosystem still needs some investments, like the charging infrastructure for electric car, for it to reach mainstream adoption. And we call that ecosystem emergence challenge. But we also see in the old technology, sometimes you can extend that technology by improvements in components or these complementary elements. So think about the gasoline cars. Nobody thought 10, 15 years ago that they will be going at 30 miles per gallon or even 40 miles per gallon, but improvements in engines, improvements in fuels allowed the cars to get to that point. You think about the hybrid versus electric car sort of discussion, where the hybrid cars introduced were able to grow market share much faster than electric cars. And the main difference is the hybrid cars could plug and play. There wasn't an emergence challenge in the ecosystem. Electric cars had these emergence challenges by creating the infrastructure, by having these charging stations in place. So at the end of the day, after doing this research, we were able to document fairly clearly that if one were to understand the likelihood that the new technology is going to come and immediately disrupt the marketplace versus it may take much longer or may not happen, you have to look at the new technology ecosystem in terms of its emergence challenge and the old technology ecosystem in terms of the extension opportunity. And it's really the joint consideration of these two factors that explains whether you will see a fast technology takeoff or a technology that will never reach mainstream adoption. The research presents some very interesting takeaways for managers, for policymakers, for investors into technology companies, and also for users of technologies, whether you're consumers or businesses. So if you are a manager of a firm, whether it's a new startup or it's an established firm, you always have to think about sort of resources that you have to allocate towards new technologies and how you transition between an existing to a new technology. So think about Kodak shifted from the chemical-based to the digital photography, or you think about Netflix moving from a DVD rental business to the online streaming business. And so what we find is, managers can use this framework to set realistic expectation in terms of both whether and when to invest in new technologies. And it may sometimes actually make sense, and they will generate more shareholder value or destroy less shareholder value by focusing on the existing technologies than kind of going all out and pushing for the new technology. From an investor's perspective, again, it sets realistic expectations when you are investing in technology companies in the ability to create value over time. Sometimes the expectations could be 2 years, but as we know, anecdotally, it often takes much longer than that for new technologies to create value. Users, same sort of decisions, whether you're a business or a consumer, you're always up against a decision, should we go for the latest and greatest, or should we wait until the new technology is developed to a point where it creates value? And so having this sensibility in terms of existing ecosystem and new ecosystem can help them make more optimal decisions. Policymakers, this is a big question in terms of the role of policy in shaping technological progress. And we know that a lot of economic progress that we see is driven by improvements in technology. So if you run into a scenario where the new technologies are not emerging at the rate where you expect them to sort of emerge, that has a downside in terms of jobs, in terms of economic output, in terms of GDP growth. So thinking more in terms of ecosystem, both for the new technology and the existing technology, helps all of these actors get better returns on the investments, get less surprises in terms of expectations. That was the original intention in terms of our ability to forecast how technologies are going to evolve over time. And the title of the paper has S-curves as a way people have thought about it. And there are two different ways people thought about forecasting technologies. One is thinking about the performance improvements of the technologies. And we know that those performance trajectories tend to be an S-shape. Early stage, you invest a lot, but you're not getting improvements. Then there's a takeoff where you expect most of the market takeoff, and then there's maturity. Similarly, like that, there's an adoption S-curve, which is the early stage of the technology. The users who are going to be going after it are not the ones who really care about the total value, but they just like the new technology. That's a very small part of the market. The mainstream users are looking to see what's the main value proposition, not just technology being new. And that depicts an S-shaped distribution as well. So what we were up against is these existing frameworks and tools, which has this nonlinear S-shaped dynamics. And what we are able to show through this ecosystem-based sensibility is that the pattern of these evolutions, both in terms of technology improvement and market adoption, may not fit well with the smooth S-shaped trajectories. And they often could be very non-linear patterns, could be very discontinuous patterns. And having this sensibility can help you predict, right, whether the S-shapes are going to be smooth and quick, or these may not be S-shaped and they may actually get resolved in a much longer time frame. And where I'm going with this project is exactly along those lines, is to have a a model and an approach that helps us to improve technology forecasting. In fact, one of the things I was surprised when we were doing this research is the amount of resources that both companies and governments were expending into these new technologies, often running into hundreds and billions of dollars. As you know, semiconductor industry is very capital intensive. And despite these resources and expectations, they have well-documented industry roadmaps that say these new technologies are going to be hitting mainstream 3 to 5 years. More often than not, they would take double the amount of time, or in many cases, never take off at all. And that's something that I was not expecting as much. I was expecting some of it, but not at the scale that I observed. The other issue that I thought was particularly surprising is, we kind of write off existing technologies and old technologies. The cell phones, nobody's going to use it. Everybody's going to shift to, let's say, tablets and newer ways to do things. But seemingly geriatric technologies continue to create a lot of value for a very long time, and that was counterintuitive for what we expected to see in this result, especially in an industry which is being driven by Moore's law. So I think from a firm perspective, as we said, the big implication is thinking about resource allocation and whether it makes sense for firms to go all out on these new technologies at the rate that they expect to invest. The other implication from a firm perspective is timing. In a related study, I was able to document that, first mover advantage, as we often claim in many technology settings, turns out not to be the case. And in fact, we were able to show significant first mover disadvantage in technologies where the ecosystem emergence challenge was so high that first movers couldn't create any value. So issues of timing was important. Another issue that I think managers and investors need to think about is a technology is seldom a single artifact or a single technology element. It is the ecosystem. And that makes it very difficult for firms to control all the elements that go into creating value from the technology. So one sensibility that I'd like to share with the managers and investors is, as we think about evaluating technological opportunities, it's not enough to look at just the focal technology, whether it's the phone or it's the computer or it's the car, is to think about the ecosystem. What are the elements that go into it? And could you orchestrate the ecosystem in a way that mitigates these potential downsides of the users not deriving value when the technology is ready? What was particularly interesting from our study was every time the new technology was introduced, that technology was actually superior in terms of performance. But despite that, it never reached mainstream adoption. And the explanation was really rooted in the ecosystem of the new technology and the ecosystem of the old technology. We had a case where new technology came in 3 times, 4 times superior performance. But a critical element that the users need to use, so think about you have a camera as this technology, but you need the film. But the film that is available with this new technology is not as good for you to get the full potential of this new camera. So users don't really see an incentive. So you're coming up with the best camera, but with a below par film, and the total value proposition is not there. In other cases, the technologies are fairly incremental, but they're able to plug and play, like a hybrid car, for example, and that doesn't see these sort of resistances and frictions in the marketplace. From a venture capital perspective, again, as we think about these entrepreneurial ecosystems as a way for venture capitals to sort of get in and create value, again, you cannot just localize on a single firm as a basis of investment, as a basis of value creation. If you think about e-books as a case in point, a lot of venture capital investments, companies like E-Ink back in the day, were funded through a lot of VC money, both private venture capital, but also corporate venture capital. But it wasn't about the ink itself. It was about content. It was about the reader. It was about Amazon's business model that had to bring the solution together. So as we think about the opportunities for venture capital, for any given technology, it's not enough to just focus on that technology, but thinking about the broader ecosystem and how one could control and drive progress through the ecosystem. Important misperception that you see quite often is, fairly optimistic, aggressive expectations about new technologies, and some people call it hypes, and some people, refer to it as hype cycles. And I think we are able to kind of identify reasons of those hypes. And just calling them as a hype is not enough, in my view, is to understanding the factors that drive the hype and then using that as a basis of making good decisions. There was clearly very high expectations in our research context that these technologies would reach mainstream adoption. We're going to be investing millions, if not billions of dollars into these technologies, but it turned out those investments were in vain because either the ecosystem didn't emerge at the right time or at the cost that made it attractive for the users. The second sort of misperception is, again, this very dramatic views about the decline of the old technologies and this framing of the world as a world of disruption and all the value is going to be created through creative destruction coming from new technologies. We do feel that part of the world is a bit oversold, and in fact, a lot of the value in semiconductors and in many of the other industries that I've studied is being created through continued innovations and finding market opportunities through existing technologies. And we found that in our context as well. A very interesting company called Ultratech has been in this industry for 40 years that we have studied this industry. It has never been at the cutting edge of the technology like some of its peers who entered and exited in a fairly short span. And this company has existed for a very long time and still creating a lot of shareholder value. So I think those perceptions in terms of a very optimistic view of the new technologies and a very pessimistic view of the value proposition in the old technology is something that we think needs to be more balanced as opposed to these extreme views. So we are certainly not the first ones to study new technologies and the ability to create value in the marketplace. But I do think that we are one of the first, if not the first, to bring to attention the important role of the ecosystem in the way the technology gets developed and commercialized. And to really understand how these technologies transition and technology dynamics, we think it's not enough to just take the ecosystem perspective, but look at both the new technology ecosystem and the old technology ecosystem. It's really bringing these two ecosystems together as an analytical framework can generate a lot more valuable insights in our view. And we showed that in our research by just looking at the new technology on its own. The other sort of aspect of the research, which I think I'm particularly proud of, is the approach that we took to study this question. It was, it required almost 2 years of field work. We interviewed more than 30 industry practitioners, managers, consultants from a variety of roles in the ecosystem. And that took a lot of time, but we felt that we were able to generate a set of robust findings that made that effort worthwhile. It's something that we don't often see in a lot of management research. So this was, in my view, probably a first step for me to try to think about how one could make better decisions in terms of new technologies and provide a framework that could guide that decision making. I think we're still not quite at the point I would like us to be in terms of our ability to forecast technologies, both existing and new, and to kind of take a more probabilistic view that can guide managerial decision-making, venture capital investments, and even how policymakers think about. So what I'm sort of moving on is to take the issue of technology forecasting more seriously. And anecdotal evidence suggests that we're actually very poor technology forecasters. I mean, there's not a lot of documentation in terms of accuracy of forecasting. But if you look at some of the big technology forecasts that come out, nobody tracks them, which is a problem, of course. But anecdotally, you can tell that a vast majority of them turn out to be wrong, either in terms of missing the timing completely or missing the new technologies that nobody predicted 3 to 5 years ago. So my goal is to think about the theoretical logic, but also think about an estimation modeling approach that helps us to predict new technologies in a way that we have not been able to do so far. And I'm starting with the auto sector, which is going through some fairly interesting shifts at the moment. As we've shifted from the electrification, now we're talking about autonomous cars. We have the technology companies coming into it in addition to the auto sector. And so I think it's an environment that presents a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of variability in terms of technological choices being pursued. So I'm working on a project where we will try to create good forecasting models, and hopefully we can show the accuracy of these forecasting models in explaining many of the technologies being pursued in the auto sector. And the hope is to kind of take that as a template and apply it in other technology settings. Think about Internet of Things, think about wearable technologies, think about financial technologies, and we could scale this model to make better technology forecast.